The morning came in cold and flat, the kind of October sky that couldn't decide whether to rain or just hang there gray and heavy until everybody forgot what blue looked like. He drove his old truck down the county road before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, the engine ticking the way it always did, until the oil warmed up, the cab smelling of hay dust and the faint trace of motor oil that had soaked into the bench seat over the years. He wore his denim jacket and his faded service cap, the one he put on every morning without thinking about it, the way some men put on their faith. The county livestock auction was already loud by the time he pulled into the gravel lot. Pickups lined the fence. Men stood in clusters by the gate, breathing steam, coffee cups in hand, talking the way farmers talk in autumn, about prices, about hay yields, about which neighbor had finally given up and sold his equipment. He walked through them quietly, nodding when nodded at, saying little. The pens were full. Beef cattle, a few hogs, some older ewes. And then, in the last corner pen, barely visible between the fence rails, a cluster of small moving shapes. He stopped. They were goat kids. 24 of them, give or take, most only a few weeks old, some looking younger than that. Small, bony. Their coats were patchy and damp, and they pressed together in the corner of the pen like they were trying to share whatever warmth existed between them. A few were unsteady on their legs. One sat down and couldn't seem to decide if it was worth getting back up. He watched them for a long time. When the auctioneer got to that pen, the crowd thinned. Men drifted toward the coffee urn or back to their trucks. The auctioneer was a broad man with a silver belt buckle and a voice built for volume, and he looked down at the kids with the expression of a man being asked to sell something embarrassing. "All right, folks," he called out, spreading his hands. "What we got here is 24 head of what somebody generously called goat kids. Undersized, few of 'em iffy, gonna need round-the-clock attention from whoever's foolish enough to want 'em." He grinned at the men still watching, basically throwing money in a hole. But hey, hole's right there if you want it. A few men laughed. Nobody bid. The auctioneer called a number. Silence. He called it lower. More silence. One hand went up. Slowly. Deliberately. The auctioneer blinked at him. Serious? He didn't answer that. He kept his hand up. The gavel came down more out of surprise than ceremony, and the laughter that followed him to the pen was relaxed and easy. The laughter of men who figured they'd just watched somebody make a mistake they'd be talking about for a while. He didn't hurry. He got the truck backed up, spread fresh hay in the bed, and started lifting kids in one at a time. He drove home slow, the way a man drives when he's thinking about what he's just taken on and doesn't mind the weight of it. The kids shifted and bumped in the truck bed, small hooves skittering on the hay he'd spread, and every few seconds he checked the mirror to see they were still standing. Most were. A couple sat down and stayed down, and those were the ones he watched closest. The barn was ready. He'd been getting it ready for 2 weeks before he even walked into that auction yard, which told you something about how deliberate a man he was. Fresh bedding laid deep, not a thin scatter but a real floor of it, inches thick, the kind that holds heat and gives small legs something honest to push against. 2 heat lamps hung on adjustable chains from the center beam, positioned low enough to warm the pen floor, but high enough nothing could reach them. He'd checked the bulbs twice and kept 2 spares on the shelf. The water buckets were set. The milk replacer was measured and mixed, and waiting in covered jugs. He had done this the way he did everything, once, correctly, without hurry. He unloaded the kids one at a time, the same as he'd loaded them. Each one got a moment held against his chest before it went down into the pen. Not out of sentiment exactly, though maybe some of that too. Mostly it was assessment. He could feel which ones were cold straight through, which ones were shaking, which ones pressed into his coat and which ones pushed away. Information. He filed it and kept moving. When the last kid was in, and the barn door was pulled shut against the autumn wind, he stood for a moment and listened to them, that collective small chorus of bleating and shuffling, and the tap of hooves finding their footing. And then he went to the corner of the barn where he'd set the basket. His wife had kept it for years in the back bedroom, wooden handles, worn smooth. Inside it, worsted wool in a dozen colors she'd picked out herself over time, and her needles, and a small notebook where she'd penciled pattern notes in handwriting he still recognized at a glance. He didn't look at the notebook long. He took out a set of needles and the first skein, and sat down on the milking stool. He'd learned basic knitting from her the winter before she got sick. He was slow at it, and had no particular talent, but slow and untalented can still produce a finished thing if you're patient. And patience was one thing nobody had ever had reason to deny him. He'd spent the 3 weeks before the auction practicing the pattern. Small, fitted, with a hole for the neck and 2 for the forelegs. The first sweater went onto the first kid just after dark. It was bright orange, slightly uneven at one shoulder, and it fit. The kid looked down at itself and then looked up at him. He reached for the next skein. By the next morning, the county knew. That is simply how small places work. One person sees something through a barn door left open. One person mentions it at the gas pump. One person tells the feed store clerk, who tells the next 3 men through the door. And by noon, a thing that happened in a private barn on a quiet county road has already been shaped, trimmed, and turned into a joke with a punchline everyone agrees on before they've even heard it properly. The younger farmer across the road heard it from his wife, who heard it at the grocery. He walked to the fence line that afternoon, the wooden rail fence that separated his large, orderly property from the veteran's modest patch, and he stood there with his arms folded on the top rail and looked across. The old man was in the pen, moving slowly down the row of kids, checking each one, adjusting a sweater that had ridden up on a small brown doeling. The younger farmer watched for a moment. Then he laughed. It wasn't a quiet laugh. It was the kind a man produces when he wants to make sure the other man can hear it. Full, unhurried, satisfied with itself. The veteran did not look up. The feed store became the story's real home, the way feed stores always do in counties like that one. Men came in for wire staples or mineral blocks or bags of layer pellets and left with something better, the image of a weathered old man sitting in a lamplit barn, pulling wool sweaters onto goats the size of house cats. The clerk told it well. He had a good eye for the ridiculous detail, the bright orange one, he kept saying, slightly uneven at the shoulder. The men leaned against the counter and shook their heads and laughed with the particular pleasure of people who feel very certain they would never do such a thing. The auctioneer was the one who carried it to the diner. He had a regular table on Thursday mornings, and he sat down and told it from the beginning. The auction, the scrawny lot of kids nobody wanted, the old man raising his card, and then the sweaters. He paused for effect. The whole table roared. Someone said the word sentimental. Someone else said soft in the head. The auctioneer said he'd seen a lot of things at that barn over the years, but he'd never expected to be selling goats to a man who was going to dress them for winter. The veteran heard it. In a county that size, you hear everything eventually, whether you want to or not. The diner story reached him through a neighbor who told it with some embarrassment, watching his face for a reaction. There was no reaction. He thanked the neighbor for letting him know, went back inside, and at 4 o'clock, as he did every afternoon without variation, he walked down to the barn and began his evening feeding round. The kids pressed forward to meet him, sweaters and all. The kids grew, not fast, not dramatically, not in any way that made the neighbors stop what they were doing and take notice, but they grew, week by week, quietly and without ceremony. The small bodies that had arrived, trembling and hollow-eyed, began to fill out. The ribs that had been visible under the wool sweaters gradually disappeared beneath actual flesh. The legs that had buckled on arrival found their footing. The eyes cleared. The voices got louder, more insistent, less desperate. The kind of bleating that meant hunger rather than fear. And that was a difference the veteran understood precisely. He didn't say anything about it. There was no one to say it to. And even if there had been, he wasn't built that way. He simply noted it the way a man trained to observe notes things, methodically, without celebration, filing it away as confirmation of what he had already known. The county chalked it up to luck. That was the word that went around. Those little runts must have pulled through, lucky for him. Nobody amended the diner story. Nobody went back to the auctioneer and said, "You know, maybe the old man was onto something." The sweaters remained a joke, and the fact that the kids wearing them were visibly thriving was quietly separated from the sweaters in everyone's accounting. The care disappeared from the explanation. Only the outcome remained, and the outcome got credited to chance. The veteran let it go at that. What he did not let go of was the radio. It ran low in the barn every morning and every evening, a small AM station out of the county seat that gave weather reports on the hour, practical and plain, the kind of forecast that told you what the air pressure was doing and where the wind was coming from. He listened the way he listened to most things, without comment, without moving much, just absorbing. By mid-October, he had made 2 trips to the farm supply store, 2 towns over, a place far enough away that nobody from his county was likely to see what he was loading into the bed of the truck. He came back with heat lamps, more than a man his size should need for a barn that small, more than the number of animals he was running could seem to require. He stacked them in the back corner of the barn, still boxed. He made a 3rd trip for colostrum concentrate and milk replacer, cases of it, stacked against the wall beside the lamps. He added hay beyond what his animals would eat in any reasonable season. The barn began to fill in a quiet way, organized and deliberate. Each addition placed with the same care he gave everything else. Nobody asked about it. His neighbors drove past on the county road and saw an old man carrying boxes, and they didn't slow down. It looked like ordinary farm work, which in a way it was. The radio kept running. The air pressure kept dropping. The mild autumn had done what mild autumns always do to people, who want to believe the worst is behind them. It had made them comfortable. The corn was in, the hay was baled, the barns were latched against ordinary cold, and the county had settled into the particular ease of a season that seemed to be going easy on everyone for once. Men leaned on fence posts and said it wasn't so bad. They said maybe winter would be late this year. They said they'd seen worse. He had not said anything. He had watched the leaves come down faster than usual on the north side of the old oak at the edge of his property. He had watched the woolly bear caterpillars moving low and deliberate along the county road shoulder, dark on both ends, in a way that made him pay attention. He had felt the quality of the air in the early mornings. Not just cold, but dense. The kind of cold that sits below the surface of a regular chill and waits. He had learned to read those signs in a different country, in a different kind of cold, a long time ago. He had not forgotten what they meant. On Tuesday morning, a little before 6, the radio said it plainly. The announcer's voice was steady and official, the kind of voice that reads numbers without alarm, which sometimes makes the numbers harder to hear for what they are. Record low temperatures, 48 hours, chills well below 0, duration unknown. The county seat was advising residents to protect pipes, livestock, and the elderly. He listened until the announcement was finished. Then he reached over and turned the radio off. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, not moving. The goat kids were already bleating softly out in the barn, their small voices carrying through the cold air, the way they did every morning when they heard the farmhouse door. He could hear them even now, through the walls. He pulled on his jacket. He pulled on his second jacket over that. He settled his service cap onto his head, tugged the brim down once, and went outside. The cold that met him at the door was not yet the cold that was coming, but he could feel the announcement in it already. the way a room feels different before a storm even arrives. He crossed the yard without hurrying, but without wasting a single step. Inside the barn, he moved through the pens with the quiet efficiency of a man running through a checklist he had already memorized. He checked every lamp. He counted fuel canisters. He ran his hand along the hay bales stacked against the far wall and did the arithmetic without speaking it aloud. He looked at each kid, one by one, sweaters still sitting snug against their thin ribs, their eyes calm and unaware. 48 hours. He thought about what 48 hours of that kind of cold could do to an animal too young to hold its own heat. Then he went back to work. He started with the walls. There were gaps he had known about for years, places where the old barn siding had warped and pulled away from itself, thin lines of daylight visible when the sun was at the right angle. In summer they were nothing. In ordinary cold they were manageable. In what was coming, they would be wounds. He worked methodically, pulling old feed sacks from a pile he had set aside the week before, cutting them into strips with his pocket knife, pressing them into the gaps, and tacking them flat. It was not elegant work. It did not need to be. It needed to hold heat, and it would. He moved around the entire barn that way, checking every seam, every corner, every place where wind could find purchase. His knees ached in the particular way they always ached in cold weather, a deep, grinding complaint he had learned to work around rather than through. He did not stop. He did not sit down to rest. He kept moving because movement was its own kind of warmth, and because there was too much left to do for sitting. By mid-morning, he was laying down a second run of bedding across all the pens, clean straw, thick and loose, deep enough that the kids would sink into it slightly when they lay down and be surrounded by their own warmth on every side. He had enough. He had planned on enough. He had bought the extra bales in October, when the feed store men had looked at his receipt and raised their eyebrows at the quantity, and he had said nothing, just folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket. He repositioned every heat lamp, angling each one, checking the distance from the bedding, running his hand through the warm circle of air beneath each bulb to test its coverage. He checked every cord, every connection, crouching down with a flashlight to look at where the wires met the outlets along the far wall. Everything held. He made himself verify it twice. In the afternoon, he went through the pens again with a different purpose, crouching beside each kid and running his hands along their sweaters, pulling a stretched collar back up over thin shoulders, tightening a loose loop of yarn at the belly, checking that nothing had ridden up or bunched in a way that left skin exposed. A few of the older kids pulled away from his hands, growing bold enough now to resist being fussed over. He let them be impatient. It meant they were strong. He smoothed the sweaters down anyway. By evening, the temperature outside had dropped another 8 degrees. He could feel it when he stepped out briefly to check the sky. The stars were brilliant and hard-edged, the kind of sky that meant no cloud cover, no insulation, nothing between the ground and open space. He knew what that meant for the night ahead. He went back inside. He filled every water bucket while the lines could still run. Then he settled in to wait, and to watch, and to not sleep very much at all. While he watched his barn and waited, the rest of the county was deciding the whole thing was overblown. The younger farmer across the road had heard the radio that morning, the same flat, serious voice reading the same numbers. He'd listened while he poured his coffee, and by the time the cup was half empty, he'd made up his mind that the forecast was the kind of noise weathermen made when they needed something to say. He'd seen hard freezes before. He knew how they worked. You threw down an extra bale, you made sure the water wasn't standing in low spots, and you let the animals do what animals had done for 10,000 years before anybody ever worried about it. He did exactly that. 1 extra bale per pen. Then he went inside and watched football. At the feed store, the debate ran most of the afternoon. 2 men near the back held that the temperature wouldn't drop more than 15 degrees below the forecast floor, that these early winter predictions always ran dramatic and almost never delivered. Another man, older, said he'd seen a November like this once before, and you didn't want to be caught short. But even he wasn't sure enough to act on it. Mostly they stood around the iron stove with their hands in their pockets and debated the thing like it was a matter of opinion, which it was, right up until it wasn't. A few farms around the county made half-hearted gestures. Someone nailed a sheet of plywood over a gap in the north wall of a barn. Someone else dragged out a single heat lamp they hadn't used since the previous winter and set it in the corner nearest the youngest animals. One man strung a tarp across the open face of a lean-to and told himself it would hold whatever came. These were reasonable men who had farms to run and weather that had disappointed them before, and they did what reasonable men do. They prepared for the weather they expected, not the one that was actually coming. What was actually coming didn't negotiate. By mid-afternoon of the second day, the temperature had already dropped past the point the radio had named as the overnight low. By 4 o'clock it was still falling. The sky had gone the color of old iron, flat and low, and pressing down on the fields like something with weight behind it. The wind, which had been quiet all day, finally found its direction and began to move, not in gusts but in a steady, deliberate push out of the northwest that didn't pause and didn't warm, and carried the kind of cold that gets into wood and metal and stays there. Out on the county road, his rusty truck sat in the same spot it had been all day. Inside the barn, the heat lamps were already burning. The kids were already warm. The temperature kept going down, and the night hadn't even started yet. The wind found the county properly around 9 o'clock. Not the edge of it, not a warning of it, the full weight of it, rolling down from the northwest across every open field and finding every gap in every barn wall and every crack in every door that hadn't been sealed in the fall the way it should have been. Temperatures that had been dropping steadily all evening began to fall faster, the way water moves when it finally finds the drain. The radio in the feed store had gone quiet for the night. The landline phones sat on their cradles. Most of the county was already in bed, trusting that their preparations were enough, trusting that the forecast had overstated it the way forecasts sometimes do. They were wrong. By midnight, the thermometer nailed to the old veteran's barn door had dropped past 12 degrees, past 10, past 8. It stopped moving for a while around 7, then started again. Inside, the heat lamps burned orange and steady, throwing their circles of warmth down onto the deep hay, like small patient suns that didn't know how cold it was beyond them and didn't care. The kids were pressed together in loose clusters, wool against warm hide, their small sides rising and falling with breath that misted faintly in the air at the edges of the lamplight. The sweaters were doing what he had known they would do, not magic, not sentiment, physics, trapped warmth, wool holding heat against skin that couldn't hold enough of its own. Every single kid was alive. Every single one of them bleated softly when he came through the door to check on them at midnight. A sound like something between complaint and comfort, like they were telling him about the cold the way animals do, without accusation, without drama. He moved through the pens slowly, his bad knees talking to him with every step in the frozen air, his breath a steady fog around his face. He checked the lamps. He pressed fresh hay against the pen walls where the wind was finding the boards. He looked at each animal the way a man looks at something he decided to believe in when no one else would. Outside those barn walls, the same wind was moving across the county without mercy. It was finding the younger farmer's lean-to across the road. It was pushing through the loose boards of the auction barn where they'd laughed at him in September. It was reaching into the feed store man's outbuildings, into the spaces between bales that weren't stacked deep enough, into the pens where young animals stood without sweaters, without lamps close enough, without the layers of preparation that a man lays down when he decides that what is fragile actually deserves to survive. Nothing dramatic was happening yet, not yet, but the cold was patient. The cold didn't need to be dramatic. It just kept doing what cold does, pressing in, finding the thin places, settling into everything that wasn't ready for it. The night still had hours left. The dark before dawn was the coldest part. He had risen before 4, same as always, pulling on his denim jacket in a room where the window had grown a thin skin of frost on the inside of the glass. His knees ached in the particular way they always did when the temperature dropped below a certain point, a point that had arrived hours ago and kept descending. He didn't check a thermometer. He didn't need to. He could feel it in the boards under his boots when he crossed the yard, in the way the air hit the back of his throat like something sharp, in the quality of the silence itself, which had become dense and absolute, the way silence only gets when the cold has pressed everything down flat. He pushed open the barn door and stepped inside. The heat lamps were still burning, every one of them. The amber light fell across the pens in the same warm pools it always did, and underneath that light, 23 kids lay breathing, shifting, some of them already awake and turning their small faces toward him. The sweaters, the green ones, the red ones, the oatmeal-colored ones with the uneven ribbing, rose and fell with the slow, steady rhythm of animals that had made it through. He went pen to pen, counted each one, checked the positioning of every lamp, adjusted 2 that had shifted slightly on their clamps, pressed more hay against the north wall, where the cold was leaning hardest against the boards. He refilled water before it could freeze. He moved without hurry and without waste, the way a man moves when he has learned that panic serves nothing and attention serves everything. Every single one of them was alive. He stood in the center of the barn for a moment and let that fact settle into him like warmth. The AM radio on the shelf near the door crackled to life with the morning farm report, and the announcer's voice came through measured and serious. The coldest recorded November morning in the county in over a decade. He listened without expression. He had known it was coming. He had been ready for it since September. He was filling the first water bucket of the morning when the landline rang. It was mounted on the barn wall, an old wall phone, yellow plastic gone cream-colored with age. He picked it up on the second ring. There was a pause on the other end before the voice came, and when it did, he barely recognized it. The voice that had carried so easily across a fence in September, so certain of itself, so quick with a laugh, that voice was gone. In its place was something quieter, stripped down, uncertain how to ask for what it needed. 3 kids lost overnight, the rest dangerously cold. Did the old man have any heat lamps to spare? The barn was quiet around him. The kids were bleating softly in their pens. He didn't make the man wait long for his answer. He told the man across the road to bring what he had left, and come now, before they got any colder. That was the first call. It was not the last. By 8 in the morning, the landline had rung 4 more times. The feed store owner's brother-in-law, a quiet man who ran a small mixed herd 2 townships over, called without any pretense at all, just the flat voice of someone doing arithmetic on losses and coming up short. He had 5 kids down. He didn't know if they were going to make it through the hour. The veteran talked him through the immediate steps on the phone, told him the temperature to aim for, told him what not to do, and then told him to get in his truck and drive over. The widow woman, 2 farms south, called next. She had inherited her late husband's goats along with everything else, and she knew livestock well enough, but she had never seen cold move through a barn this fast. She was calm on the phone, calmer than most of the men had been, and she asked clear questions. He answered them all. The one that gave him a moment's pause was the call that came just before 9. He knew the voice immediately. It was the man from the diner, the one who had laughed the loudest, who had repeated the sweater story to anyone in the county who hadn't already heard it, who had made sure the joke traveled. There was a long silence after the line connected, long enough that the veteran thought he might have heard wrong. Then the words came out slowly, each one costing something. He had kids down. He was out of options. He was asking, The veteran told him to come. By mid-morning, his small county road had seen more traffic than it usually saw in a week. Trucks pulled in one at a time, parking along the fence line, engines ticking as they cooled in the frozen air. Men climbed out carrying limp kids wrapped in feed sacks, in old towels, in whatever they had found in the truck cab. He showed them where to set the animals down, adjusted the heat lamps to the right distance, demonstrated how to rub circulation back into legs that had gone stiff. He shared the colostrum supply he had stocked since October, portioning it carefully so it would stretch. He walked men through tube feeding when their hands weren't steady enough to manage it alone. He did not lecture. He did not remind anyone of September, or the diner, or the fence. When someone started to say something that sounded like the beginning of an apology, he just handed them a bottle and pointed them toward the pen that needed attention. There was too much work to do. That was the only answer the moment required. The second night came down like a lid. The temperature dropped faster than the radio had warned it would, and by 8 o'clock the thermometer nailed to the barn door had bottomed out at the peg. He brought in 2 more men who arrived just before dark, a father and son from the south end of the county, faces tight with the particular shame of having nowhere else to go. They carried 4 kids between them, 2 wrapped in a burlap sack, 2 pressed against the old man's chest under his coat. He took the animals without a word, assessed each one by touch, the temperature of the ears, the give of the belly, the strength of the cry, and sorted them into the pens according to what they needed. By 9 o'clock, the barn held more animals than it was built for. His own kids, bright and warm in their wool sweaters, pressed curious noses through the slats at the newcomers. The visitors were a ragged sight by comparison, shivering, dull-eyed, some barely moving. He worked the pens by the amber light of the heat lamps, and a single lantern hung from a rafter nail, and the shadows moved slow and long across the straw. His knees had been bad since Korea. He did not think about that. He knelt where kneeling was needed, and stood when standing was needed, and did not waste a moment acknowledging the difference. He tube-fed the ones that couldn't suckle. He rubbed legs. He repositioned heat lamps by inches, reading each animal the way a man reads weather. Small signs, constant adjustment, nothing assumed. The father and son worked alongside him, taking direction without question now, the last of their pride worn off somewhere around midnight. He did not talk much. There was a quality to the silence in that barn that asked to be respected. Just the hiss of the lamps, the soft complaint of the wind finding gaps in the siding, the periodic bleating of 30-some animals packed into a space meant for fewer. He had kept watch in colder places, in worse dark, waiting for a morning he wasn't sure would come. He did not say that out loud. He did not need to. His hands said it. The way he moved between the pens said it. The army had taught him something that had no formal name, that the job in front of you is the only thing that exists, and the small ones do not get left, and you do not stop until every one of them that can be saved has been saved. Around 2 in the morning, one of the newcomers, a kid that had arrived barely breathing, stood up on its own legs and shook itself. Nobody said anything, but both the old man and the younger farmer's son saw it happen, and something passed between them in the lamplight. The night was still long. The light came slowly, the way it does after a killing cold, pale and thin, almost apologetic, spreading across frozen fields that had nothing left to prove. The wind had quit sometime before dawn. The silence it left behind was enormous. He was still in the barn when the gray seeped through the gaps in the siding. He had not slept. His knees had long since stopped complaining about that. Or maybe he had stopped listening. He moved through the pens one last time with a hand lamp, counting, touching, checking. The small bodies radiated their stubborn warmth back at him, through wool and skin. Every sweater-clad kid he had carried into autumn was still here. All of them. The ones he had brought home from the auction when nobody else would have them. the ones the county had written off before they had a chance to prove themselves. He set the lamp down and stood very still in the middle of the barn for a moment, surrounded by soft bleating and the smell of hay and lanolin and animals that had come through the night. He had known mornings like this before, mornings that cost something. They began arriving not long after sunrise, his neighbors, one by one, coming up the county road on foot or in trucks, with fogged windows, breath rising in the cold air. The younger farmer from across the road came first, his son beside him, neither one of them speaking. Then two men from the east side of the county who had heard through the telephone line what had happened. Then, eventually, the feed store owner, his hands in his coat pockets, his face carrying an expression that was not easy to name. They stood in front of the open barn doors and looked at 24 goat kids in hand-knit sweaters, alive, warm, bumping against each other in the pens, and nobody laughed. Nobody said much of anything for a while. He did not gloat. He did not fold his arms or let his expression say what his patience had earned the right to say. He simply stood to one side and let them look, and then he began telling them quietly what they could do for the animals they had left, and how to do it, and they listened to every word. The feed store owner left before the others. He drove back into town and stood behind his front window for a long moment, with one of the small wool sweaters in his hands, one the old man had pressed on him the night before without explanation. Then he set it in the window where the whole town could see it, and he did not take it down all winter. The veteran stood in his barn at full light, surrounded by bleating kids, finally understood. He pulled his service cap a little lower, picked up a feed bucket, and went back to work.